Oh my God, she's my commanding officer. The words cut through the wedding reception like a lightning strike. The bride's bouquet slipped from her hands and hit the polished wooden floor with a soft thud. Every head in the room turned toward me. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. I stood frozen near the entrance of the country club ballroom, my hands still wrapped around the strap of my purse. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the bride, Emily Carter, looked straight at me with wide eyes full of disbelief and recognition. And Daniel, the man who once promised to marry me, went pale beside her. If someone had told me a year earlier that I would someday walk into Daniel Harper's wedding reception and watch his bride drop her bouquet because of me, I would have laughed. But life has a strange way of circling back on itself. And sometimes the moment that looks like revenge from the outside is really just the quiet closing of a door. A year earlier, I had been the bride. My name is Sarah Whitaker, and at the time I was 36 years old and serving as a logistics officer in the United States Marine Corps. I had grown up in Greenville, North Carolina, the kind of town where everyone knows your parents, and church attendance still counts as a measure of character. My father worked 32 years at a paper mill before retiring. My mother taught second grade at the same elementary school I attended. We weren't wealthy people, but we were steady. And steady was something I always valued. When I met Daniel Harper, I thought I had found someone built the same way. Daniel was an accountant at a small firm downtown. Clean-cut, polite, dependable. The kind of man older folks in town described as good husband material. We dated for 3 years. During that time, I deployed twice. Daniel wrote letters, real letters on paper. My mother adored him. My father shook his hand the day we announced our engagement and said, "Take care of my girl." Everything about our future seemed simple. And for people our age, simple was enough. The rehearsal dinner was held on a warm Friday evening at a small Italian restaurant off Evans Street. Our families filled 2 long tables. My father told stories about my childhood. Daniel's mother kept complimenting the wedding decorations. My best friend from high school toasted us with a glass of sweet tea and said she had never seen 2 people more meant for each other. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. I remember thinking how calm everything felt. After years of military schedules, deployments, and distance, tomorrow felt like the beginning of something peaceful. By 10 o'clock that night, I was back in my small apartment, carefully hanging my wedding dress on the closet door. The lace sleeves caught the lamplight. I remember touching the fabric and smiling. Outside, Greenville was quiet. The kind of quiet small towns settle into after dark. At 10:47 p.m., my phone rang. "Daniel." I answered with a smile in my voice. "Hey, you?" But he didn't say hello. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. And then he sighed. The kind of sigh a man makes when he has already made up his mind. "Sarah," he said slowly, "we need to talk." My stomach tightened. "What's wrong?" Another pause. I can't go through with the wedding tomorrow." The words landed like cold water. At first I thought he meant nerves. A lot of men get nervous before weddings. I tried to laugh gently. "Daniel, it's normal to be scared. We've both got a lot of family coming tomorrow." "It's not that." His voice was flat. "It's my parents." That sentence alone told me more than he probably realized. Daniel's parents had always been polite to me. But polite isn't the same as welcoming. His father owned several car dealerships across eastern North Carolina. His mother chaired more charity committees than I could count. To them, I was the Marine officer from a middle-class family whose career meant deployments and unpredictability. Not the kind of daughter-in-law they imagined. "What about them?" I asked quietly. Daniel cleared his throat. They think we rushed into this." I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the phone tighter. "We've been together 3 years." "I know." "Then what changed?" The silence stretched. Finally, he said the words that ended everything. "They introduced me to someone." I felt something inside my chest drop. A woman named Emily Carter. Her family's from Raleigh. Her father owns a construction company. They think she'd be a better match. A better match. I stared out the kitchen window at the dark street below. "So you're canceling our wedding," I said slowly, "because your parents found you someone richer." "It's not just that." "Daniel." My voice had gone very calm. "Are you marrying me tomorrow or not?" He exhaled again. "Number." That was it. 3 years together. One word to erase it. I didn't cry. Not right away. The Marines teach you something early. When something goes wrong, emotion can wait until after the situation is handled. I see, I said. Daniel sounded relieved that I wasn't yelling. I'm sorry, Sarah, I really am. But apologies after betrayal sound hollow. We should tell everyone tonight, I said, before people start arriving tomorrow. Yes, that's probably best. He hung up 10 minutes later. I stood alone in my kitchen. The wedding dress hung in the next room. The life I had imagined was already gone. Around midnight, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on my door. She had heard voices through the wall earlier. When she saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She simply wrapped her arms around me. Come sit down, honey, she said softly. And that's when the tears finally came. 2 days later, I packed a Marine duffel bag and accepted a new overseas assignment. I didn't fight Daniel. I didn't argue with his parents. Some doors close best when you simply walk away. At the time, I thought that night would be the last chapter of that story. But a year later, I would walk into Daniel Harper's wedding reception, and the bride would drop her bouquet because she recognized me. The woman Daniel's parents had called a better match. If you had asked me in those first few weeks after the canceled wedding what the future looked like, I probably would have told you I didn't know. Not because my life had collapsed completely, but because the life I had imagined was suddenly gone. For a while, everything felt strangely quiet. Quiet can be dangerous when you're heartbroken. Your mind has too much room to replay things. That's one of the reasons I accepted the overseas assignment so quickly. The Marine Corps has a way of filling empty space. 3 weeks after the wedding that never happened, I was on a military transport headed for Kuwait, where my new logistics unit was stationed in support of Marine operations throughout the region. It wasn't combat duty. My job involved supply coordination, fuel shipments, equipment movement, convoy planning. But the environment still demanded discipline and focus. And that's exactly what I needed. The first few weeks were exhausting in the best possible way. Long hours, endless paperwork, constant radio calls, problems that required immediate solutions. It left very little room for thinking about Greenville, North Carolina, or Daniel Harper. Most evenings after the desert heat faded and the base quieted down, I would sit outside the temporary housing units with a cup of bad coffee and call home. My mother always asked the same question. Are you doing okay, honey? And I always gave the same answer. I'm getting there. Which was true. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in quiet pieces. About 4 months into the deployment, a new batch of Marines arrived on base. Among them was a young corporal named Emily Carter. The name meant nothing to me at the time. She was 24, maybe 25, with bright eyes and the kind of energy that reminded me of myself when I first joined the Corps. Eager. Confident. Still learning how the military world really worked. She had been assigned to a transportation unit that often coordinated with my logistics office. The first time we spoke, she knocked on my office door holding a stack of shipping forms. Ma'am, she said, Corporal Carter reporting. I looked up from my desk. Yes, Corporal. She stepped inside and placed the paperwork down carefully. I think someone messed up these convoy manifests. Her tone was polite but determined. I glanced over the forms and saw immediately what she meant. 2 supply trucks had been listed under the wrong escort unit. A small mistake, but one that could cause confusion once the convoy hit the road. You're right, I said. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. I wasn't sure if I should bring it up. You absolutely should. I signed the corrected forms and handed them back. Good catch, Corporal. She smiled. That was the first of many small interactions between us over the following months. Emily turned out to be one of those Marines who takes the job seriously without losing her sense of humor. She worked hard, asked smart questions, and never complained about long hours. I began to trust her judgment. Something that matters more than people realize in the military. The day everything changed happened late in the summer. It was one of those scorching afternoons where the desert air feels like it's pressing down on your shoulders. A supply convoy had just returned from a long route north of the base. Several vehicles needed maintenance checks before being cleared again. Emily's unit was responsible for inspecting one of the transport trucks. I was reviewing paperwork in my office when the alarm siren suddenly started screaming across the base. Anyone who has served knows that sound. Your body reacts before your brain even catches up. I stepped outside immediately. A column of dark smoke was rising from the vehicle inspection area. Someone shouted from across the yard, "Truck fire!" Marines were already running toward the scene with extinguishers. The truck had apparently suffered a fuel line rupture during inspection. Diesel was leaking onto the hot engine block. Flames had spread quickly along the underside of the vehicle. But what caught my attention immediately was the shouting. "Someone's inside." One of the mechanics yelled it. The driver's side door was jammed, and inside the cab, partially visible through the windshield, was Emily Carter. She had been checking the dashboard systems when the fire started. For a split second I stood there calculating the situation. The fire wasn't enormous yet, but diesel burns unpredictably. If the fuel tank ignited, the entire vehicle could explode. The other Marines were trying to pry open the door, but the metal frame had warped from the heat. Emily was conscious. I could see her moving inside trying to kick the door open. But panic had set in. That kind of moment leaves you with very little time to think. You either act or you watch something terrible happen. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the maintenance table and ran forward. "Move!" The Marines at the door stepped aside. I slammed the wrench against the side window twice. The glass shattered. Smoke poured out of the cab. "Corporal Carter," I shouted, "climb out!" She was coughing, disoriented. I reached through the broken window and grabbed her arm. "Come on!" She scrambled halfway through the opening just as flames began licking along the front hood. Another Marine pulled her the rest of the way out. We dragged her several yards away before the fire crew finished putting out the blaze. Emily lay on the ground gasping for air. Her face was streaked with soot. But she was alive. She looked up at me with wide, shocked eyes. "Ma'am?" Her voice trembled. You came in there." I shrugged lightly. "That's what Marines do." But she shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "You saved my life." Emily was treated for minor burns and smoke inhalation. Within a few weeks, she was back on duty. From that day forward, she treated me with a kind of quiet respect that went beyond normal rank protocol. Sometimes she would stop by my office just to check in. Other times, she would join the small group of Marines who gathered outside in the evenings. One night, she said something that stuck with me. "You know something, ma'am." "What's that?" "You're the bravest woman I've ever met." I laughed softly. Bravery usually just means someone else needed help. She thought about that for a moment, then nodded. Eventually, the deployment ended. Orders came through for several of us to return stateside. I flew home almost exactly 1 year after the night Daniel canceled our wedding. Greenville looked the same as always. Quiet streets. Brick storefronts. The same church steeple rising above the downtown trees. But people had moved on. Life had kept going. A few days after returning, I ran into an old friend at the grocery store. She mentioned something casually while we stood near the produce aisle. "Did you hear Daniel Harper's getting married next month?" I forced a polite smile. "No, I hadn't." She nodded. "Nice girl from Raleigh, I think, Emily something." The name barely registered at first. But later that evening, as I sat alone on my porch, it came back to me. Emily Carter. And suddenly the past and present began to collide. For the first few seconds after my friend mentioned the name in the grocery store, I didn't react at all. I simply stood there beside the apples and oranges, nodding politely while she continued talking about local news and church activities. But the name kept echoing quietly in the back of my mind. Emily Carter. It wasn't an unusual name. There are probably thousands of Emily Carters across the United States. Still, something about it tugged at my memory. When I got home that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and let the silence settle around me. Greenville looked exactly the same as it always had. Same quiet neighborhoods. Same oak trees lining the streets. Same distant hum of traffic from the highway. But after spending a year overseas, the town felt smaller somehow, and slower. I tried to dismiss the thought that had crept into my mind. It couldn't be the same Emily Carter. The odds were too strange. But curiosity has a way of working on you. So I did something I rarely do. I searched the wedding announcement online. Small towns often post wedding notices in the local newspaper's digital section. It took less than 2 minutes to find it. The announcement read, Daniel Harper and Emily Carter request the pleasure of your company at their wedding reception next Saturday evening at the Greenville Country Club. Beneath the announcement was a photograph of the couple. I stared at the screen, because the woman standing beside Daniel was unmistakably the same Corporal Emily Carter I had pulled from the burning truck. My Marine, the young woman who had once looked at me and said I was the bravest person she knew. For a long time I just sat there, not angry, not even shocked, mostly thoughtful. Life has a peculiar sense of timing. A year earlier, Daniel had canceled our wedding because his parents believed they had found him someone better. And now that woman was someone whose life I had saved. The coincidence felt almost too strange to be real. That evening, I walked down the street to visit Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had comforted me the night everything fell apart. Her small white house looked exactly as it had the year before. The same wind chimes hung from the porch, gently clinking in the evening breeze. She opened the door with a warm smile. Well, look who's home from saving the world. I laughed softly. Not quite the world. Close enough. We sat at her small kitchen table while she poured sweet tea into 2 tall glasses. Mrs. Patterson had lived in Greenville longer than almost anyone I knew. Her husband had been a school principal for 30 years before he passed away. She had the kind of wisdom that only comes from watching generations of people grow up, make mistakes, and learn from them. After a few minutes of small talk, I finally told her, "Daniel's getting married." She nodded slowly as if she had expected that news eventually. "Well," she said calmly, "that doesn't surprise me." I took a sip of tea. "The bride is Emily Carter." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "The Marine." "Yes." Now that got her attention. She leaned back in her chair, studying my face carefully. "That must feel complicated." I thought about that word. Complicated. It probably described the situation better than anything else. "Honestly," I said slowly, "I don't know what I feel." Mrs. Patterson waited. She was very good at letting silence do its work. Finally, I spoke again. "I saved her life last summer. I remember you telling me about that." She had no idea Daniel and I were ever engaged. Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like she was caught in the middle of something she didn't know about." "That's exactly what happened." Another moment passed. Then she asked the question I had been quietly avoiding. "Are you going to the wedding?" I looked down at my hands. "No one invited me." "That wasn't my question." I smiled faintly. Mrs. Patterson had a way of cutting through things. "I don't think showing up would be appropriate," I said. "Maybe," she replied gently, "but sometimes the only way to close a door is to walk through it one last time." Her words lingered in the room. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on settling back into life at home. The Marine Corps had given me a few weeks of leave before my next assignment. I helped my parents around the house, visited old friends, went to church Sunday morning. But the thought kept returning. Daniel and Emily, the wedding reception, the strange connection tying everything together. By Thursday afternoon, I realized something important. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't even thinking about Daniel. What I kept thinking about was Emily. She deserved to know the truth about how her relationship with Daniel had begun. Not because I wanted to embarrass anyone, but because honesty matters, especially when someone is about to build a life with another person. The reception was scheduled for Saturday evening at the Greenville Country Club, the same place Daniel and I had originally planned to hold our celebration a year earlier. That detail alone felt almost surreal. On Saturday afternoon, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror holding a simple navy blue dress. Nothing flashy. Nothing dramatic. Just something appropriate for a quiet appearance. For several minutes, I debated whether to go. It would be easier to stay home. Easier to let the past remain in the past. But Mrs. Patterson's words echoed again. Sometimes the only way to close a door is to walk through it one last time. So I put on the dress, drove across town, and parked outside the country club just as the sun was beginning to set. The parking lot was full of cars. Soft music floated through the open ballroom doors. I sat in my car for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then I stepped out and walked inside. I had no idea that within minutes the bride would see me across the room and drop her bouquet in shock. The ballroom at Greenville Country Club looked exactly the way I remembered it from the planning meetings a year earlier. Soft white lights hung across the ceiling beams. Round tables were covered with cream-colored linens. A small jazz trio played near the far wall, their quiet music floating through the room like a polite background conversation. For a moment, standing just inside the doorway, I had the strange feeling of stepping into a life that might have been mine. But the feeling passed quickly. Because the truth was simple. That life had never truly belonged to me. I moved quietly toward the back of the room and found an empty seat near one of the side tables. No one seemed to recognize me right away. Time changes people, and a year is enough for memories to blur around the edges. Guests chatted casually. Waiters carried trays of drinks through the crowd. Someone laughed loudly near the bar. Across the room I spotted Daniel. He stood near the center of the ballroom talking with several guests, his hand resting comfortably in his suit pocket. He looked almost exactly the same as he had the last time I saw him. Same confident smile, same perfectly combed hair. The only difference was the ring box resting on the head table behind him. For a moment our eyes met. Recognition flickered across his face. Then confusion. And finally something that looked like worry. He hadn't expected to see me there. But before either of us could react further, the room began to shift. The band paused. Someone near the entrance called out cheerfully, "Here comes the bride." Everyone turned toward the large double doors at the front of the ballroom. The doors opened slowly, and Emily Carter stepped inside. She looked beautiful in a simple ivory dress, her hair pulled back neatly, her smile bright and confident. She carried a bouquet of white roses and walked forward with the calm grace of someone who believed she was stepping into the happiest moment of her life. The room filled with applause. Daniel moved toward her with an eager smile. But as Emily walked forward, greeting guests along the aisle between the tables, her eyes began scanning the room. And then they landed on me. For a split second, she simply stared. Her smile vanished. Her eyes widened with disbelief. The bouquet slipped from her hands. White roses scattered across the floor. The entire room fell silent. Emily raised one trembling hand toward me. "Oh my God." Her voice echoed across the ballroom. "She's my commanding officer." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Daniel froze beside her. Emily didn't even look at him. She walked straight toward me. Guests stepped aside as she passed, whispering to each other in confusion. When she reached my table, she stopped only a few feet away. "Ma'am," she said softly. Then something completely unexpected happened. She wrapped her arms around me in a tight embrace. For several seconds, the entire ballroom simply watched. I could feel her shoulders shaking slightly. "You're alive," she whispered. I chuckled gently. "Last time I checked." Emily stepped back, wiping at the corner of her eyes. "I can't believe you're here." "Neither can I admitted. The room was still silent. Guests stared openly now, trying to understand what was happening. Finally, someone spoke from the head table. It was Daniel's mother. "What exactly is going on here?" Her tone carried the sharp edge of someone who disliked losing control of a situation. Emily turned slowly toward the crowd. Then she looked back at me. "You saved my life," she said firmly. Several people murmured in surprise. Emily faced the room. "This woman pulled me out of a burning transport truck in Kuwait last summer." Now the murmurs grew louder. "I would be dead if she hadn't broken the window and dragged me out." The band members stood quietly beside their instruments. The waiters had stopped moving. Even the air in the room felt still. Emily looked at me again with deep respect. "I never got the chance to properly thank you." "You don't owe me anything," I said gently. "That's not true." Daniel finally stepped forward, his voice uncertain. "Emily, what are you talking about?" She turned to him slowly. "You never mentioned knowing Sarah Whitaker." My name sounded strange coming from her voice. Daniel's expression tightened. "Emily, this isn't the time for—" "She was engaged to you, wasn't she?" The words landed heavily. A few guests gasped quietly. Daniel's father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "That was a long time ago." "A year," Emily replied. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "You canceled your wedding the night before the ceremony." Now the entire room was listening carefully. Emily looked around at the crowd. "Did everyone here know that—" No one answered. Daniel's mother stood abruptly. "That situation has nothing to do with today." Emily turned slowly toward her. "I think it has everything to do with today." The older woman's face reddened. We encouraged Daniel to reconsider a relationship that wasn't right for him. Emily crossed her arms. And you thought I was a better option? The silence in the room grew almost uncomfortable. Finally, Emily looked back at me. Ma'am, did you know he was marrying me? No, I answered honestly. I found out a few days ago. And you still came here? Yes. Why? I took a breath. Because you deserved to know the truth. The room remained completely still. Emily studied my face carefully. Then she nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. Behind her, Daniel looked increasingly uneasy. What exactly are you saying? He asked. Emily turned toward him. Her voice was quiet but unmistakably clear. I'm saying we need to talk. And suddenly the wedding reception no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like the moment before a storm. For several long seconds after Emily said those words, we need to talk, no one in the ballroom moved. The soft clink of a glass somewhere near the bar was the only sound in the room. Daniel looked from Emily to me and back again, clearly trying to figure out how the evening had slipped so far out of his control. His mother was the first to break the silence. This is ridiculous, she said sharply, folding her arms. Emily, whatever confusion there is, it can be sorted out later. Right now we have guests waiting. Emily didn't even look at her. Her eyes stayed on Daniel. Is it true? She asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation told everyone in the room more than any explanation could have. Yes, he said quietly. Sarah and I were engaged. Emily nodded slowly, absorbing the words. And you canceled the wedding the night before. Daniel rubbed the side of his face. It wasn't that simple. I almost smiled at that. People often say it's not that simple when the truth actually is very simple. Emily tilted her head slightly. Then explain it to me. Daniel glanced at his parents, who were standing stiffly near the head table. His father cleared his throat. Emily, there's no reason to embarrass anyone here. These things happen in relationships. Emily's voice stayed calm. What things? People realize they're not compatible. But you told me something different, Emily replied. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. What do you mean? You said your last relationship ended because of work schedules, because military life was too complicated. He looked down. I didn't want to get into details. Emily turned toward me again. Ma'am, were you the one who ended the engagement? No, I said quietly. I see. The room had grown so quiet now that you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Guests looked from face to face, unsure whether to stay seated or slip quietly out. Emily picked up one of the fallen roses from the floor and turned it slowly between her fingers. Daniel, she said after a moment, did your parents encourage you to break off that engagement? Daniel didn't answer right away. His mother stepped forward again. We simply wanted what was best for our son. Emily looked directly at her. And that meant introducing him to me. We thought you two had more in common. More money, Emily said evenly. Daniel's father shifted again. That's not fair. Isn't it? The older man sighed heavily. Emily, your family is well established. Daniel has worked very hard to build his career. We believed a partnership like this would provide stability. Emily's voice stayed quiet. And Sarah didn't offer that stability. Daniel finally spoke again. Emily, please, this isn't how I wanted things to happen. How did you want them to happen? I thought the past was behind us. Emily gave a short, sad laugh. The past has a funny way of walking into the room when you least expect it. She turned toward me again. Ma'am, did you know Daniel and I were dating when you saved my life? Number. And when did you find out? 3 days ago. Emily studied my face carefully. You could have stayed home tonight. Yes. But you came anyway. Yes. Why? I looked around the room for a moment. Every guest was watching. I came because I thought you deserved honesty before making a lifelong promise. Emily nodded slowly. Thank you. Daniel's voice rose slightly, now frustration creeping in. Emily, this is getting out of hand. Sarah made her point. Everyone understands there were mistakes in the past. But we're here to celebrate our future. Emily turned toward him. Are we? Of course we are. You never told me the truth about how your last engagement ended. That was over a year ago. That doesn't make it irrelevant. Daniel ran his hand through his hair. I didn't want to hurt you. Emily's eyes softened slightly. Daniel, Do you understand something? What? If you could walk away from a woman the night before your wedding because someone wealthier appeared, how do I know you wouldn't do the same thing to me someday? The question hung heavily in the room. Daniel opened his mouth but didn't answer. Emily continued quietly. You told me you respected my military service. I do. Then you should understand something about Marines. She gestured toward me. That woman standing there risked her life for me without hesitation. That's what loyalty looks like. She paused. And loyalty is the foundation of marriage. Daniel's mother stepped forward again, clearly losing patience. This conversation is completely inappropriate. Emily turned toward her. No, Mrs. Harper. What's inappropriate is building a marriage on a lie. Daniel's father tried to intervene. Emily, emotions are high tonight. Let's not make decisions we might regret. Emily shook her head slowly. I'm not acting on emotion. She placed the rose back onto the table. I'm acting on clarity. Daniel's voice dropped. What are you saying? Emily took a deep breath. I'm saying I won't start my marriage knowing it began with dishonesty. The words were gentle, but they landed like a judge's final verdict. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. You're canceling the wedding? Emily nodded. Yes. Gasps rippled through the room. His mother looked furious. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Emily looked around the ballroom one last time. Then she turned to me again. Ma'am, thank you for being brave enough to walk into this room tonight. I gave her a small nod. You deserve a life built on truth. And just like that, the celebration that had begun as a wedding reception quietly unraveled into something else entirely. For several moments after Emily said the wedding was canceled, the room stayed completely silent. No music. No conversation. Just the quiet rustle of people shifting in their chairs, unsure what to do next. In small towns like Greenville, people rarely witness something this uncomfortable in public. Weddings are supposed to be tidy, predictable affairs. Smiles, photographs, polite speeches. Not hard truths spoken in front of 200 guests. Daniel stood frozen beside the head table, staring at Emily as if he were still waiting for her to laugh and say it was all some kind of misunderstanding. But Emily didn't laugh. Instead, she walked slowly to the center of the room and faced the guests. I'm very sorry, she said, her voice steady. I know many of you traveled a long way to be here tonight. A few people nodded sympathetically. But I can't begin a marriage without honesty, she continued. And tonight I learned something important that I didn't know before. She glanced briefly toward me. I hope you understand. For a moment no one spoke. Then an older man near the back table stood and said gently, You're doing the right thing, young lady. A few other guests murmured in agreement. Emily gave them a grateful smile. Daniel, however, looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under his feet. Emily, he said quietly, we can talk about this privately. She shook her head. We already are talking about it. His mother stepped forward again, her voice sharp with frustration. This entire situation is unnecessary drama. Emily turned calmly toward her. No, Mrs. Harper, what's unnecessary is pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Daniel's father placed a hand on his wife's arm, trying to calm her down. But she pulled away. You're making a terrible mistake, she told Emily. Emily's expression softened slightly. Maybe, she said, but it will be my mistake to make. The older woman's face turned red with anger. You're throwing away a wonderful future over a misunderstanding. Emily shook her head. No, ma'am, I'm refusing to build a future on someone else's heartbreak. Her words hung in the air. For the first time that evening, Daniel looked directly at me. His expression was complicated, part embarrassment, part regret. Sarah, he said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken my name that night. I never expected you to show up. I didn't expect to be here either, I replied calmly. He took a hesitant step toward me. I'm sorry for how things ended. The apology sounded sincere. But sincerity doesn't erase consequences. I know, I said. Daniel rubbed his hands together nervously. I didn't handle things well. That's true. Another long pause passed between us. Finally, he said, I thought I was doing what my parents wanted. I looked at him carefully. Daniel, you were 38 years old. Several guests shifted awkwardly at that. Your parents didn't cancel our wedding, I continued quietly. You did. He lowered his eyes. You're right. Across the room, Emily was speaking quietly with a few guests who had come to check on her. After a moment, she walked back toward us. "I owe you an apology too," she said to me. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," she insisted gently. She clasped her hands together. "When Daniel and I started dating, I had no idea about the engagement. If I had known, I would have asked questions. You weren't responsible for his choices," I told her. "Maybe not," she said, "but I still feel terrible about it." Her honesty made it difficult to hold on to any anger. And the truth was, I didn't feel angry anymore. Time and distance had done their quiet work. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. Emily looked around the room again. Many of the guests had begun gathering their coats or quietly finishing their drinks. The wedding reception was dissolving into an awkward but calm departure. "I guess we should let people head home," she said softly. "That might be best," I agreed. Daniel's parents stood stiffly near the head table, clearly unsure how to salvage what was left of the evening. For them, reputation mattered deeply. But reputation is a fragile thing when honesty enters the room. Emily turned back to me once more. "Ma'am, thank you again." "For what?" "For reminding me what real courage looks like." I smiled slightly. "Courage usually just means doing the right thing when it's uncomfortable." She nodded thoughtfully. "I'm starting to understand that." Daniel watched the two of us silently. Finally, he spoke again. "Emily, I never wanted to hurt anyone." She looked at him kindly. "I believe that. But intention doesn't erase the outcome." Daniel didn't argue. For a man who had spent most of his life avoiding difficult moments tonight had forced him to face one directly. Emily extended her hand toward him. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." He shook her hand slowly. "You too." There was no bitterness in her voice. Just finality. After that, people began leaving in earnest. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Waiters started clearing glasses from the tables. The band quietly packed their instruments. I picked up my purse and prepared to head toward the door. As I walked past the entrance, Emily called after me. "Ma'am." I turned. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said again. I thought about that for a moment. "You know something," I said gently. "What?" "This isn't revenge." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "Revenge would mean wanting someone else to suffer. And that's not what you wanted." "Number." "Then what did you want?" I smiled softly. "Peace." Emily nodded slowly. "I think you found it." And for the first time in a long while, I realized she was right. The ballroom at Greenville Country Club was nearly empty by the time I stepped outside. Night had settled softly over the golf course. The air carried that warm Carolina humidity that never quite leaves even after sunset. Somewhere in the distance, crickets had begun their steady chorus. I walked slowly toward the parking lot, my heels clicking quietly on the stone walkway. A year earlier, I had imagined walking into that building wearing a wedding dress. Instead, I was leaving it with something far more valuable. Closure. As I reached my car, I heard the door behind me open again. "Ma'am?" I turned. Emily Carter stood on the porch steps barefoot now, her wedding shoes dangling from one hand. Without the bright lights and the crowd around her, she looked much younger. "Just a Marine again. Just a person trying to figure out life. Mind if I walk with you for a minute?" she asked. "Of course." We stood beside my car for a moment, neither of us quite sure what to say next. Finally, she spoke. "I never imagined my wedding day ending like this." "I doubt anyone ever does," I said with a small smile. She looked down at the gravel beneath her feet. "My parents are going to be shocked when they hear about it." "I imagine they will. But they'll understand eventually." "You think so?" She nodded slowly. "My father always told me something when I joined the Marines." "What was that?" "That character is the one thing you have to carry for the rest of your life. Everything else, money, careers, houses, can disappear." She looked back toward the building where guests were still quietly leaving. "I think tonight I protected that." "You did," I said. For a moment we both stood quietly. Then she looked at me again. "I've been meaning to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When you realized Daniel was the man I was going to marry, why didn't you call me earlier?" I thought about that carefully. "Because I didn't want to influence your decision." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "But you came tonight." "Yes." "Why?" "Because sometimes the truth deserves to be spoken in the open." She nodded slowly. "That makes sense." After a moment, she added, "You know, when I joined the Marines, I thought courage meant running toward danger. And now I think it sometimes means walking away from the wrong life." I smiled. "That's a lesson it takes some people decades to learn." She laughed softly. "Well, at least I figured it out before signing a marriage certificate." We both chuckled at that. Then she looked at me with a more thoughtful expression. "You know something else?" "What's that?" "If you hadn't shown up tonight, I probably would have married him." "That's possible. And a few years down the road when the truth came out, it would have hurt a lot more people." "That's also possible." Emily leaned against the railing, thinking. "Funny how life works." "It is. You saved my life twice." I shook my head. "I only broke one truck window." She smiled. "The second time was tonight." A few months passed after that evening. Life settled back into its normal rhythm. I returned to duty at a logistics base in Virginia where I began training younger Marines in supply coordination and leadership. The work felt meaningful again. One afternoon I received a letter in the mail. Not an email. A real letter. The handwriting on the envelope looked familiar. Inside was a short note. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know I've been reassigned to Camp Pendleton. I'm continuing my service with the transportation unit. Thank you again for everything you taught me about courage, about honesty, and about standing up for the right thing. I hope one day I can be the kind of Marine you were for me. Respectfully, Corporal Emily Carter." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Not long after that, another letter arrived. This one from Daniel. His message was longer. He apologized for how he handled our engagement. He admitted he had spent most of his life trying to please everyone around him, instead of deciding what kind of man he wanted to be. He didn't ask for forgiveness directly, but I gave it anyway. Not for him, for myself. Because holding on to bitterness is like carrying a heavy pack long after the mission is over. Eventually, you have to set it down. These days, when younger Marines ask me about life or relationships, I sometimes tell them a simple truth. Character reveals itself in difficult moments. Anyone can look good when things are easy. But when pressure arrives, when choices become uncomfortable, that's when people show who they really are. Daniel showed me who he was. Emily showed me who she was. And that night at the country club, I discovered something about myself too. The greatest revenge isn't humiliating someone. It isn't proving someone wrong. The greatest revenge is building a life so strong that the past no longer controls your future. I eventually started volunteering with a veterans mentorship program for young service members returning home from deployment. Some of them carry heartbreak. Some carry regret. But all of them need to hear the same lesson. Life doesn't always unfold the way we planned. Sometimes a door slams shut the night before a wedding. But that doesn't mean the story is over. Sometimes it simply means a better chapter is waiting. If this story reminded you of someone you know, or if you've ever faced a moment where honesty mattered more than comfort, take a moment tonight to reach out to someone who helped guide your life in the right direction. And if stories like this speak to you, feel free to share them with someone who might need a little encouragement. Because sometimes the quiet lessons we learn along the way become the most valuable stories we can pass forward. And in the end, the wedding I lost gave me something far more meaningful: peace.